The public library has an unused third floor. Part 2, Loosen a Fox's Tongue. Written by BeneficialScars. I was 15 when my parents got divorced. It's a story similar to most. Once their little bundle of joy didn't need so much attention from them, husband and wife had the time to realize that they didn't actually like each other that much. They got divorced in the most mundane fashion possible. I was to spend weekends with my dad and weekdays with my mom. My dad wasn't even planning on moving out of town, just a couple of neighborhoods over. It happened when I was at my first weekend with my dad. I had kept the book all these years. I tried to return it, but there was no possible way to do so. When I thought about simply leaving it somewhere in the library, I felt sick. What if I left it in there and the third floor opened back up for whoever found it to return it themselves? I just couldn't risk it. I took on that burden in the way every teenage boy thinks they're saving the world by sacrificing themselves. So there I sat for those years. It laid almost listless on my bookshelf, shoved off to the side and out of my sight. That is, until it was time to move. I felt compelled to bring it with me to my dad's. The risk was too great for my mom to stumble upon it while I was gone. So, into my dark blue duffel bag the book went. I had never opened it in all of those years, and I never planned to. I just needed to keep it close so that no one else ever would. Dad was helping me unpack. He had rented a 2-bedroom bachelor pad and he showed me to my room. He'd gotten baseball sheets for the twin bed. I hadn't played baseball in years, but he was trying. I sat down the duffel bag on the bed and I looked around. So, I remember thinking to myself, this is my weekend home. How fancy. Dad had unzipped my duffel bag and was tossing out the clothes onto the bed to put away in my new IKEA dresser drawers. Then he grabbed the book. "Hey, this is wonderful, Jake. You're a reader, just like your dad," he said, holding up the hefty book. "Oh, that's personal," I yelped as I grabbed the book. "What is it anyway? I don't think I'm familiar with Loosen a Fox's Tongue," he said and flipped it open to the first page. There was a black and white sketch on the first page. No room for an author. The ink strokes moved together to show a human hand clutching the tongue of a fox, still resolutely in its mouth. The fox's eyes were watery and far away. "Hey, bud, this is a little weird. What's it about?" He flipped to another page, and I felt like I was rushing back to the third floor of the library. The symbols were the same. The letters swum in and out of the page, blurring and twisting around my field of vision. Words like mistake and hallowed rose to the front of the page and then sunk back in. I couldn't understand any of it. Still, all these years later. He flipped wordlessly through the book. More illustrations appeared, then disappeared just as quickly. There was a saw sketched darkly in the blackest ink. A fallen tree. Eyes watching from a cottage. A storm. And more words. He turned the pages so quickly that I didn't think he was even looking at the pages. Then it happened. "Oh, shoot," he said. He held his hand up, and I could see a small bead of dark red blood blossom from the tip of his thumb. A paper cut. I braced myself for the inevitable reckoning the book would wreak upon him. The milky white liquid, the pain. Then nothing. He shut the book and tossed it back onto the bed unceremoniously. "I'm just gonna grab a Band-Aid. Do you want to order some pizza for dinner?" he said over his shoulder as he left. The night passed largely without incident. We ate pizza and then watched old reruns on TV. Dad fell asleep in his chair. I ran back to my room periodically throughout the night to check on the book. It still laid there, innocently on the bed, daring me to find anything out of place. The only change was a small dark spot on page 78, where my dad had gotten cut. Its twin spot was on the opposite page, where the pages met together, 2 twin blood stains. This was one of the pages that had an illustration. Despite my resolution to not acknowledge the book at all, I looked. Once again, it was a black and white sketch, but this time, it was a stone in the woods. Roots curled over it and rotted leaves gathered at its base. There were no other details, but it still gave me a horrible feeling, accentuated by my dad's blood at the very edge of the page. I threw the book onto the floor and kicked it under the bed. It could rot there for all I cared. I'd finally drifted off to a restless sleep when I was woken up by a groaning noise from the room next to me. I could hear the sound of the bed frame knocking against the wall and twin groaning noises. I just remember being furious. Was this why my parents had gotten divorced? Because my dad couldn't keep it in his pants for one night when his son was staying with him? I stomped to his door and banged loudly against it. The groaning and banging only got louder in response. It was almost deafening. I threw the door open against the wall and froze. I could see my dad's form laying in bed, and the form of a woman, fully clothed, straddled him. His head lolled to one side, and I could see the blankness in his eyes. He wasn't there anymore. The woman didn't seem disturbed by my screaming. She just kept feeding. I fled the room to get the book, thinking that maybe if I just gave her this cursed book back, I could fix it. I'd been saved once. I could save my dad too. I crawled under the bed to grab the book, but it seemed affixed to the floor. It was too heavy to even budge to the side. I struggled with it, snot flowing out from my nose as I cried. I knew that my dad was gone, whether or not I could rip the book off the floor. Then I felt it. A clammy hand wrapped itself slowly around my ankle. Then another hand wrapped itself around my other ankle. It was quiet, and I waited for the end I knew was coming. I fastened my grip on the book, then felt myself being pulled out from under the bed. The woman looked down at me and dropped my ankles back to the floor. She smiled at me like a lover as she leaned tenderly over me. Her white teeth were impossibly sharp, like the teeth of an eel that I'd seen in an old picture book once. The book had slid out with me from under the bed and laid open above my head. She frowned at it for a moment and then leaned closer. Looking into the book, her mouth still open. Her long tongue hung out from her mouth, and she stared transfixed at the pages. I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed it and I pulled. It was damp and spongy in my hands, and she thrashed around it. Her mouth gaped, and she tried desperately to close her teeth around my hand, but she was choking on her tongue. I pulled harder and felt her hit the ground with a sickening wet thud. She laid there unmoving while I sprinted from the room to find my dad. He wasn't in his bed anymore. He wasn't anywhere in the entire apartment. I searched high and low, even circling the apartment complex yard. I entered the apartment again and held my breath before opening the door to my room. I didn't have the slightest idea of what to do with a dead body, but as it turns out, I didn't need to worry about it. The only thing waiting for me was the open book, daring me to look at it again. I did. The same black and white sketch of the rock greeted me. Exactly the same, except for a small crack down the middle of it. I went back to my mom's house in the morning, the book tucked into my dark blue duffel bag, slung over my shoulder. She was in her bathrobe and pajamas at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and a grocery store croissant. "How was your sleepover at Zeke's?" she asked. She seemed 1,000 miles away. "You know, Jake, I'm so happy that you and Zeke have such a great friendship. And I won't lie, after raising you on my own for 15 years, sometimes it's nice to get a break." She smiled, clearly trying to rib me. No one ever mentioned my dad again. When I asked, my mom just waved me off. She seemed so tired all the time now. Being a single mother for 15 years will do that to you.